a quiet courtroom in Louisiana, Judge Eleanor Hayes prepared for what seemed like just another day. The air was filled with the soft rustle of papers, the murmur of conversations, and the steady echo of footsteps on polished floors. But when the bailiff called the case, the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, Eleanor's world shifted. As the defendant walked in, shackled at the wrists and ankles, Eleanor froze. The man standing before her wasn't a stranger. He was James, her childhood friend. The boy who once raced her down dusty back roads and shared dreams under magnolia trees. Their friendship had blossomed in secret. She, the daughter of a white family in a segregated southern town. He, a black boy from the edge of town. They met by a creek one summer and became inseparable. But as they grew older, the world crept in. Her father eventually caught them sitting together and ordered her inside. That moment marked the end. She never saw James again. Until now. Sitting on the bench, Eleanor struggled to remain composed. James looked older, weathered by life, his shoulders hunched, but his eyes, the same soulful eyes she remembered, still carried quiet strength. The charges were serious. Assault and robbery. Yet as she listened to the prosecutor lay out the case, something in her heart resisted the narrative. She knew James. Or at least, she once did. Could the system have failed him? Eleanor was trained to be impartial, but behind her robe and gavel was a human being forced to reconcile the past with the present. She couldn't reveal their history. It would jeopardize the case. Instead, she watched and listened as the trial unfolded. The defense pointed out inconsistencies. A witness couldn't clearly identify the suspect. Surveillance footage was grainy, unreliable. An officer admitted James matched only a vague description. It was clear James had been arrested not based on hard evidence, but on assumption. As the trial progressed, James testified. He spoke not just with words, but with quiet dignity. He didn't deny his past mistakes, but insisted on his innocence in this case. "I've been fighting my whole life," he said, "just to be seen as more than what people assume about me." His words echoed through the courtroom, and through Eleanor's heart. When the jury declared him not guilty, the room erupted. But for Eleanor, the real moment came later, when James approached her quietly and asked why she hadn't said anything. Her answer was heavy with truth. "Because I couldn't." And yet, she knew that silence came at a cost. For Eleanor Hayes, that day wasn't just about justice. It was a reckoning. A reminder that the law must see people, not just files. And sometimes doing what is fair means finding the courage to confront the past. For Judge Eleanor Hayes, the courtroom had always been a place of order and reason, a space where justice was pursued with clarity and calm. But as she listened to the prosecution's case against James Anderson, her childhood friend, she began to see cracks in the very system she had dedicated her life to serving. James was accused of assault and robbery, with a store clerk claiming to have seen a man in a red hoodie attack and steal from a gas station register. Surveillance footage was submitted, but the quality was poor, too grainy to identify a face. The prosecution leaned on vague descriptions and circumstantial evidence. Yet to Eleanor, who had grown up alongside James, something didn't sit right. She remembered a boy who was thoughtful, protective, and full of dreams. Not someone who would lash out violently. As the defense attorney, a young woman named Lisa Porter, presented her case, Eleanor found herself leaning forward, listening closely. Lisa questioned the credibility of the witness, pointing out he couldn't definitively identify the attacker. Then came the arresting officer, who admitted that James had not been found with any red hoodie, nor was the area searched to confirm whether he had discarded anything. His reasoning for detaining James: he matched the description. A black man in dark clothing, walking nearby. That was all it took to arrest someone? Eleanor's stomach turned. Lisa introduced an expert witness who analyzed the surveillance footage and testified that not only was the suspect's face unrecognizable, but the timestamp appeared altered, casting further doubt on the prosecution's timeline. Eleanor knew that in any other case this might be enough for reasonable doubt, but would the jury see it that way? Would they see James as the boy she once knew, or just another defendant in shackles? Then James took the stand. His testimony wasn't polished, but it was real. He spoke about being stopped without cause, about living his entire life under suspicion. "I didn't do this," he said, voice raw with emotion. "I've made mistakes, but I didn't commit this crime. I'm tired of being treated like I'm guilty just because of how I look." Eleanor's throat tightened. In that moment, James wasn't just a defendant. He was a symbol of how easily the justice system could turn a blind eye to humanity. The prosecutor delivered a closing argument, heavy with confidence, urging the jury to trust the process. Lisa countered with a plea for compassion and critical thinking. "Look beyond assumptions," she said. "This case has more questions than answers. That alone should be enough to find James not guilty." The jury deliberated for hours. When they finally returned, Eleanor could feel the weight of every second in the courtroom. "Not guilty," the foreperson announced. A wave of relief rippled through the gallery, but James didn't smile. His freedom had come at the cost of reliving every injustice he'd ever faced. After the courtroom emptied, James quietly approached the bench. "You knew me," he said softly. "Why didn't you say anything?" Eleanor replied with difficulty, "Because I couldn't. I had to stay neutral." James nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. "The world's never been fair for people like me, but maybe now it starts to change." As Eleanor sat alone at the bench, the room now silent, she realized this case had changed her. Justice wasn't just about rules or verdicts. It was about the people whose lives hung in the balance. That day, she didn't just uphold the law. She saw its flaws. And more importantly, she saw a path forward, not just for herself or for James, but for a system in desperate need of reform. For Judge Eleanor Hayes, the courtroom had always been a place of logic, discipline, and firm boundaries. After decades on the bench, she had developed an unshakable routine, a sense of control over proceedings, outcomes, and her own emotions. That sense of control was shattered the moment James Anderson walked into her courtroom. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, he was a man charged with assault and robbery, another name in a long list of defendants she had seen come and go. But when she looked into his eyes, Eleanor didn't see a criminal. She saw the boy she once knew. The boy she used to race bicycles with down the dusty back roads of Hammond, Louisiana. The boy who taught her how to fish, who dreamed of leaving their segregated town for somewhere better. It had been more than 40 years since that summer her father forbade her from seeing him. They were torn apart not by a falling out, but by a culture that demanded separation. She had gone on to law school, a career in justice. He, apparently, had fallen through the cracks. As the trial progressed, Eleanor did everything she could to remain impartial. The law required it. The court required it. Her oath required it. But as she listened to the prosecution build a case around vague witness descriptions and grainy security footage, her legal mind began to doubt the strength of the evidence. And her heart, long buried under layers of robes, rulings, and rationality, began to ache. She listened to a store clerk give hesitant testimony, unable to clearly identify the suspect. She watched the surveillance video where a hooded figure rushed through the frame, unidentifiable and indistinct. Most importantly, she heard the arresting officer admit that James had been stopped for matching a general description, mid-40s, black, dark clothing. No red hoodie was found. No eyewitness could positively identify him. The so-called evidence had more holes than substance. And yet James stood there, not arguing or pleading, but enduring. There was a dignity in his silence, in his posture, in the way he nodded to his defense attorney but never once made eye contact with Eleanor. She wondered what he must be feeling. Betrayal? Confusion? Pain? Did he blame her for the years of silence? For leaving him behind? The guilt began to creep in, slowly at first, like a chill under the collar of her robe. Then all at once, she remembered the night she walked away from him, called inside by her father. James had looked at her with quiet understanding, even then. "Go on," he had said. And she had gone. Back in the courtroom, James chose to testify in his own defense. His words weren't polished. He didn't cry or grandstand. But what he said reached deep into the hearts of everyone listening. "I've made mistakes," he admitted. "I've had to fight to survive. But I didn't do this. I was walking home. That's all. I didn't even get a chance to explain before I was cuffed. They looked at me and decided I was guilty. Eleanor's eyes stung. She blinked quickly, willing the emotion away. She wasn't just hearing testimony. She was hearing decades of pain, spoken through the voice of a man who once sat with her under the stars and dreamed of a better world. The defense attorney's strategy became clear: cast doubt on the arrest process, challenge the identification, and point out the inconsistencies in the timeline and evidence. They even brought in a forensic analyst who suggested the surveillance footage may have been altered. The prosecution had no direct physical evidence tying James to the crime, only assumptions and circumstance, and that, Eleanor thought, was often how injustice crept in, not through grand conspiracies, but through lazy shortcuts and a system eager for easy convictions. When the jury returned with a not guilty verdict, the room seemed to exhale all at once. Eleanor struck her gavel and announced James's release. He didn't smile. He didn't look triumphant, just relieved and maybe a little tired. As the room emptied, Eleanor lingered at the bench, wondering if he would approach. He did, quietly, respectfully, and with a question that pierced her heart. "Why didn't you say anything?" She could barely respond. "Because I couldn't," she said. "I had to be fair." But James, with more grace than she felt she deserved, simply replied, "The world's never been fair. But maybe it can be, now." Later that night, Eleanor sat in her chambers, long after the building had emptied. She thought about how many Jameses had stood before her, how many men and women had been judged by a system that wasn't designed to see their full story. She had always believed in the law. She still did. But now she understood that justice wasn't something handed down from a bench. It was something built every day through courage, humility, and the willingness to see others for who they truly were. As a senior judge nearing retirement, Eleanor realized her legacy wouldn't be written in court transcripts, but in the lives she chose to see with compassion. And in that quiet moment, she made herself a promise. She would spend the rest of her career making sure the system she loved became one worthy of everyone it served. As Judge Eleanor Hayes watched James Anderson walk free from her courtroom, she couldn't help but feel the weight of something far greater than a legal proceeding. It wasn't just that the trial had ended in a not guilty verdict. It was that everything leading up to that moment had illuminated how fragile the concept of justice could be. Eleanor had always believed in the rule of law. She had built her life around it, dedicating her career to fairness, structure, and impartiality. But this case, this man, forced her to face something deeper. James was not a stranger. He was the boy she had once laughed with beneath the magnolia tree, the one who taught her how to fish and shared her dreams of escaping the limitations of their divided southern town. They had been inseparable, until life and society pulled them apart. And now, decades later, she was the judge, presiding over his fate. What struck Eleanor most during the trial wasn't just the evidence, or the lack thereof. It was the human being at the center of it all. James's arrest had been based on vague descriptions, absent physical evidence, and assumptions rooted more in bias than in fact. The arresting officer admitted he hadn't conducted a full search of the area. There was no red hoodie found, no definitive identification made, and yet James had been treated as guilty from the moment he was stopped on the street. He testified with quiet dignity, not denying his past mistakes, but firmly proclaiming his innocence in this case. "They didn't even ask me what happened," he had said. "They just saw me and decided I fit." His words rang in Eleanor's ears long after the jury left the room. In her private chambers that night, Eleanor sat in silence. Her gavel, once a symbol of authority and assurance, now felt heavier in her hand. She thought about how many people like James had stood before her bench over the years. How many had been too poor to afford a good lawyer, too scared to speak up, or too scarred by the system to hope for fairness. She had done her best, she believed that. But had her best been enough? Or had she, like so many others in power, relied too much on procedure and not enough on compassion? The courtroom is meant to be a place of justice, Eleanor reminded herself. But justice isn't just about verdicts. It's about humanity. It's about recognizing the full story behind the man in the defendant's chair, not just the list of charges printed on a sheet of paper. James's story reminded her that the legal system, as structured and revered as it may be, is only as just as the people who operate it. That morning she had seen a young defense attorney, confident, well-prepared, and relentless in pursuit of truth, do what many seasoned lawyers would not: challenge the assumptions, the gaps, and the biases embedded in the case. And that, Eleanor realized, gave her hope. As she stepped out into the fading light of evening, Eleanor knew she couldn't undo the past. Not her silence all those years ago, not the years James had spent struggling under a system that never fully gave him a chance. But she could do something now. She could listen more, question more, advocate more, and she could ensure that her courtroom would never again be a place where silence outweighed truth. James may have walked away free that day, but the lesson he left behind stayed with her. Justice, real justice, requires more than a robe and a gavel. It requires courage. It requires heart. And above all, it requires seeing people not for what they're accused of, but for who they are. Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson never imagined that a late-night drive would lead her into the center of a national conversation about justice, abuse of power, and what it means to stand tall in the face of wrongdoing. When Officer Briggs pulled her over on that quiet highway outside Birmingham, Alabama, he didn't see a decorated military officer. He didn't see a woman who had spent decades serving her country with honor and discipline. He saw only a black woman driving alone at night, and that was all he needed to justify treating her like a threat. From the moment he stepped out of his cruiser with that swagger, flashlight in hand, and ego puffed up by authority, Renee felt the shift in power. She had seen that posture before. Not in war zones or enemy camps, but right here on American soil. Officers who saw their badge as a shield for their biases, rather than a responsibility to uphold justice. When she calmly asked why she was being detained, he snapped. When she stood her ground with dignity, he escalated. He cuffed her tightly, threw her in the back of his patrol car, and told her with a sneer, "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't. Not even close. What Officer Briggs didn't know that night was that Renee wasn't just any civilian. She wasn't someone he could push around without consequence. And while she remained calm through the humiliation of arrest and the cold holding cell, her mind never stopped working. She documented everything: the unnecessary use of force, the lack of explanation, the indifference of the officers around her. She knew her rights. She also knew the law, and most importantly, she knew people. It didn't take long before calls were made, calls that went beyond the local precinct, reaching Navy command, legal teams, and eventually federal officials. Within 48 hours, Renee had been released, the arrest under review, and questions were already swirling. Why had a woman with no record, no cause for suspicion, and a decades-long record of service been arrested over a broken taillight? Why was the arresting officer's body cam footage incomplete? And why did his disciplinary history include multiple complaints, all mysteriously unresolved? As public scrutiny grew, so did the consequences. Officer Briggs, once so confident in his control, suddenly found himself on the defensive. Internal Affairs opened an investigation. Local news caught wind of the story. Civil rights organizations reached out. And then came the subpoena. Renee would testify in a misconduct hearing that could determine not only Briggs's future on the force, but the integrity of the department itself. When she walked into that courtroom weeks later, she wasn't in a cell. She was in a navy blue blazer, medals of service gleaming subtly on her lapel, a picture of quiet strength. Briggs, seated across from her, looked pale, his bravado gone. He barely raised his eyes to meet hers. The judge, the attorneys, even the gallery seemed to sense the gravity of what was about to unfold. Renee's testimony was calm, composed, and devastatingly clear. She didn't embellish, she didn't shout. She told the truth, step by painful step, as only someone with nothing to prove could. She spoke of the stop, the tone in his voice, the way his hands tightened the cuffs, the smugness in his face when he locked her in the patrol car. She spoke of how he never explained her rights, never told her the reason for arrest, and treated her not like a citizen but like a problem to be handled. Then came the video. The body cam footage, choppy and edited, confirmed her story. Missing audio, gaps in time, tone of voice that made even seasoned officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. But what sealed Briggs's fate was not just the footage, it was the paper trail. Other complaints, other victims, patterns of targeting black drivers, a tendency to escalate unnecessarily. The judge didn't need long. Briggs was suspended, pending further investigation. The mayor's office issued a public apology, and the department, long known for looking the other way, now faced pressure from every direction to finally reform. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, but Renee didn't linger. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a step, a necessary one. Later that evening, she sat quietly in a cafe, sipping coffee and scrolling through messages of support from strangers, veterans, teachers, mothers, and fellow servicewomen who had seen their own reflections in her story. One message stood out. "You didn't just speak for yourself, you spoke for all of us who couldn't." Renee set down her phone and exhaled. The truth was, she hadn't gone looking for this fight, but when it came to her, she chose to face it with strength, grace, and unwavering dignity. Not just because she wore a uniform, but because she believed in something greater than any badge: accountability. As the sun set over the city, Renee walked past the courthouse once more. She looked up at its towering columns and thought about the people still waiting for their turn at justice, the ones without the titles, without the rank, without the platform, and she made a silent vow. If her story could change one policy, hold one officer accountable, inspire one woman to speak up, then everything she endured that night would be worth it. Because justice isn't just about one case. It's about every person who's been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated by those who were supposed to protect them. And for Renee Dawson, the fight was just beginning. In the weeks that followed her unlawful arrest, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson's story became more than just a personal ordeal. It became a rallying cry. What began as a routine traffic stop quickly unraveled into a national example of what happens when power is left unchecked. Renee, a Black Navy officer with decades of service and an impeccable record, had not only endured the humiliation of wrongful arrest, she had done so with grace, composure, and an unshakable belief in the truth. As news of her experience spread, so did a renewed public scrutiny of police behavior, especially within departments that had long operated without transparency. Her name was suddenly on the lips of journalists, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens who had grown tired of the same story playing out across America, with fewer consequences and even fewer lessons learned. But Renee wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't interested in headlines or accolades. Her goal was simple: accountability. And that's where she focused her energy. Partnering with legal advocacy groups, Renee began working behind the scenes to draft policy recommendations that would prevent incidents like hers from happening again. She advocated for mandatory body camera usage, clearer protocol on traffic stops, and bias training for law enforcement officers, particularly in regions with high rates of complaints against officers of color. Her voice carried weight not just because of her rank, but because of her integrity. She wasn't angry, she was determined. City leaders, realizing the momentum behind her story, invited her to speak at a town hall meeting that drew one of the largest crowds the city had seen in years. There, standing behind a wooden podium in her civilian clothes, Renee spoke not just about what happened to her, but what it represented. "This isn't just about me," she told the crowd. "It's about everyone who's ever been stopped, questioned, or mistreated because of the color of their skin, not the content of their actions. It's about a system that has forgotten how to listen and how to learn." Her words echoed through the room, sparking standing ovations and tears alike. Soon, departments across the state began reviewing their protocols. Independent audits were launched. Internal affairs divisions received increased funding for oversight. And perhaps most significantly, officers like Briggs, those who operated with impunity for years, found themselves under long overdue scrutiny. Several former arrestees came forward, sharing eerily similar stories of mistreatment and intimidation. This time, they were believed. At the national level, Renee's case caught the attention of the Department of Defense, which used it as a training example for future interactions between military personnel and local law enforcement. She was invited to join an interagency task force focused on building trust between communities and police, a role she accepted with quiet resolve. Renee didn't just survive injustice, she transformed it into something constructive. For many seniors watching her story unfold, Renee became a symbol of a value long held dear but often tested: dignity in the face of injustice. Her calm, her strength, and her refusal to be broken served as a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly and acts boldly. Renee's journey was far from over, but one thing was clear: she had turned her pain into progress, and in doing so had given countless others a reason to hope. As we grow older, many of us find ourselves reflecting on the world we've helped shape, the values we've stood for, and the legacies we hope to leave behind. The story of Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson reminds us that no matter our age or station in life, we still have the power to inspire change through dignity, courage, and principle. Wrongfully arrested during a routine traffic stop, Renee faced humiliation, bias, and abuse of power. But instead of responding with anger or bitterness, she responded with composure, wisdom, and unwavering belief in the truth. In doing so, she became a living example of what it means to stand tall when the system tries to bend you. For older Americans, this story resonates on a deep level. Many have lived through the civil rights movement, witnessed decades of progress and setbacks, and carried stories of injustice. Some spoken, others silently endured. Renee's journey reminds us that we are never too old to demand fairness, never too distant to care, and never too powerless to make a difference. Her experience teaches that accountability must be more than a buzzword. It must be a practice. It teaches that silence in the face of wrongdoing allows injustice to grow, while speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable, can spark lasting change. Most of all, it reminds us that dignity is not just how we carry ourselves, but how we treat others and demand to be treated in return. In our communities, our families, and even in quiet conversations with friends, we each have the power to uphold justice, not with anger, but with clarity, compassion, and courage. As we reflect on Renee's story, may we find renewed purpose to speak up, to listen more deeply, and to leave behind a world where respect and fairness are not exceptions, but expectations.